It's a great honor and privilege for me to introduce Rabbi Dr. Harvey Belovski to give today's Rabbi Sacks lecture. For those who are not familiar with Rabbi Belovski, he is a British Orthodox rabbi, educator, and organizational advisor. He has been the Rav of the Golders Green United Synagogue since 2003, which very appropriately was a position previously held by Chief Rabbi Lord Sacks, who Rabbi Belovski will share thoughts on today. Rabbi Belovski grew up in Northwest London, graduated in 1989 from University College in Oxford in mathematics. He studied also at Gateshead Talmudical College, a unique meshing of worlds that give him his unique perspective. He received smicha there in 1994, and subsequently in the Kollel there. He received further smicha ordination from the Amsterdam Bet Din and Dayan Gershon Lopian, Rabbi Emeritus of Edgware Yeshurun Synagogue, whom he considers his primary teacher. In addition to all this, Rabbi Belovski holds a PhD in hermeneutics from the University of London. He's published 2 books in addition to his PhD, which truly express the worlds he's able to bring together. His first on the Hasidic great, the Shem Mishmuel, selections on the weekly Parsha and festivals, and the Shabbat Siddur companion, as well as aforementioned PhD, harmonization as theological hermeneutic, and very well written, well known for his articles in the Jewish Chronicle and for his role within the community as a whole. It's a great privilege for me personally to get to hear Rabbi Belovski speak, and for World Mizrachi as an organization to be able to include him in our program. And we look forward to continuing to hear words from Rabbi Belovski and to continue to work together to perpetuate what Rabbi Sacks did for and strengthen the community in England and around the world. Thank you again, Rabbi Belovski.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Tarragon, for that most generous introduction. And thank you to Mizrachi for creating this wonderful program in memory of my teacher, Rabbi Lord Sacks, and for inviting me to participate. Now, Rabbi Tarragon has already done quite a lot of the groundwork in explaining perhaps why I've been invited to participate in this program. I have been a rabbi in the United Synagogue, that's the centrist Orthodox community, which is under the auspices of the British Chief Rabbinate since 2003, so for some 19 years, much of which while Rabbi Sacks was the Chief Rabbi. Subsequent to his Chief Rabbinate, when he retired from the role in 2013, he and Lady Elaine decided to return to their old stamping ground in Golders Green, where, as Rabbi Tarragon explained, he was once the Rav at the end of the 1970s, at the beginning of his career. And we then built a wonderful relationship with the Sackses. I'm not entirely sure Rabbi Sacks decided that he wanted to hear my droshes every week. I have no idea whether he liked them or not. He was always inscrutable and polite and inscrutable. We built a strong relationship. And for the last 7 years of Rabbi Sacks' life, until his sad passing towards the end of 2020, we shared a community. We spoke frequently, we shared meals together, and we developed a wonderful relationship. It was also, when the time came, not what I signed up for, but to my surprise, perhaps one of the greatest honors of my professional career, a very sad honor. I was called upon to officiate Rabbi Sacks' funeral and had an opportunity to be mass with him together with other rabbis and his daughter on the day. And I also subsequently officiated his Chometz Matzeva last year. I may pepper my shiur with some remarks or stories about Rabbi Sacks, but one, we're going to speak about empowerment and charisma, balancing the two in the environment of Jewish leadership. One of the things that was so remarkable about Rabbi Sacks, and there are so many that we could devote a whole series just to stories, was his, notwithstanding his sometimes rather aloof and rather sort of academic perspective, much of which was self-protection, given the unbelievable and overwhelming demands on his time and his mind, was that actually at the right moment he could offer very practical and very real advice. Apologies for those who have heard me say one or two of these stories before, but a particular one comes to mind. A few years ago, we were sitting together in my sukkah with my family, with Rabbi Sacks and Elaine, for a meal over Yom Tov. And I noted that it was likely that due to some changes, and I'm sure that I would have to lead Ne'ilah, which I'd never done in my career, but in the subsequent year, which will be some while away, of course, almost a year away, and I would have to learn how to do this with a certain degree of competence. And Rabbi Sacks said, without any hesitation, here's a piece of advice. He had been leading Ne'ilah for years, but he said, and for those who are familiar with these things, the tune for Ne'ilah is a very specific one, and of course one only hears it once a year, and it's difficult to get wrong, particularly as he reminded me, and those into tefillah will know, that the tune for Tala and Geshem, which is sung respectively on Pesach and on Shmini Atzeres, is very similar. And if you get into the wrong tune, you can't get out of it again, and then you have the whole of Ne'ilah in the wrong tune. So Rabbi Sacks said, to avoid this problem, here is a practical tip. And it's not a tip I would have imagined he would give them. He said, I love music, but I can't read music. Here is a tip. You will notice that the opening tune for Ne'ilah sounds exactly like Happy Birthday. So all you have to do is sing Happy Birthday in your mind. Happy birthday, Yiskadal. And there you go. And once you can do that, then you can sing Ne'ilah without going wrong. And this is one of the most wonderful practical pieces of advice as a Rov I ever received, and is one of the stories I've chosen to start to give a sense of perhaps both empowerment and charisma, how they collided in one remarkable individual. We're going to come back to that. In the meantime, with your permission, I'm going to share some content and explain what I'm going to do with much of our time together. I'm going to display a text. I hope that works. Here we go. It has worked. Hope you can see this. And I'm going to tackle a subject in the coming week's parashat at Saver, which will lead me into some thoughts of Rabbi Sacks and some observations of my own. And so we're going to begin with what I've labeled classical sources. And this is the opening sequence of this week's parsha. And here we go. Va'atot tzaves b'nei Yisrael, and you shall command b'nei Yisrael v'yichveilecho. Take shemen zayis zoch kosis la'ma'or, pure, clear oil, which is crushed for the lamp, means it's intended for the menorah lighting, lahalus ne'tomid. This is describing how these should be used. The oils should be used for the menorah lamp. And so it explains where it should be used, where it's going to be placed, how it should be used. It should be an eternal statute for Bnei Israel. The next verse, Va'ato, and you, you bring near Aaron your brother, Yehonovitoi, and his sons with him, mitoich b'nei Yisrael, from among b'nei Yisrael, lechahanoli, to serve as priests for me, Aaron, Nodov, Avihu, Elozor, v'Isomor b'nei Aharon. That's Aaron, together with Nodov, Avihu, Elozor, v'Isomor, were the sons of Aaron. And again, v'Osiso, and you shall make a big day kodesh l'Aaron Achicho, holy garments for Aaron your brother, lechovod u'sifores, for glory and splendor. V'ato, the last verse. And you to daber el kol chachmei leiv, you should speak to all those of wise heart, asher melesiv ruach chochmo, with whom I have filled the spirit of wisdom, and they shall make the garments for Aaron to sanctify him, so that he can serve as a priest for me. This passage is well known. It's the opening few verses. And you'll see in a moment why it is that I've highlighted these words, va'ator, va'ator, va'osiso, va'ator. We'll come back to that. Now, there is a very, very well-known idea in rabbinic literature, which we're going to come across in source 3. And this is addressing really why the text that we've just read is read this way. The theme of this week's Parshat Tetzaveh, for those who aren't familiar, is Aaron. It is about the Kohen. It is about the role of Aaron. The focus shifts very much away from other roles to Aaron, what Aaron's jobs will be, what the role of the Kohen will be, the garments he will wear, and the latter part of the parsha is about the inauguration ceremony to dedicate the Mishkan, which is not yet built. Now, you will notice that there is no direct reference to Moshe in any of this text. And the rabbis have mused on this question. And here we go in source 2. This is actually in next week's parsha. It is in the middle of the golden calf narrative, the last 5 readings of Shemos, which are Teruma, Tetzaveh, Kisisa, Vayakel, and Pekudei, the center of all of those parishes is the story of the golden calf. There's very little narrative apart from that. And in the middle of that narrative, we find the following verses. It was the next day that Moshe said to the people, Atem chatosem chatogadolah. You have sinned very seriously. And now I'm going to ascend to the Lord. Perhaps I will be able to atone on account of your sin. Vayoshev Moshe el Hashem, and Moshe returned to the Lord. Vayomer, and he said, Vayomar onah chatoah ha'om hazeh. It seems that this people have sinned chata'ah gadolah, a great sin. Vayasu lahem Elohei zahov. They have made gods of gold for them, a reference, of course, to the golden calf. V'aton now intisoch chatosom. If you will tolerate their sin, meaning if you will forgive them, v'im ayin, but if not, please erase me from your book that you have written. And God responds, Vayama Hashem el Moshe. The Lord says to Moshe, Mi asher chotoli emchenu misifri. Who of you have sinned to me that I should delete you from my book? Meaning, I'm only going to erase from my book those people who have sinned, and you haven't sinned. This dialogue is curious. Now, in the medieval period, the 13th century, it's interesting that it's not a midrash, and I'll explain why it is in a minute. The Balaturim, the author much more well known for the great Arbaturim, the great code in 4 sections that was a forerunner of the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law. The Balaturim in his commentary to the beginning of our parsha here says the following: Lo hiskir Moshe v'zeh haseder. Moshe is not mentioned in this parsha Tetzaveh. Ma she'ein b'chol hachomish mishal Moshe. Not the case for in any parsha from when Moshe was born. Obviously, before he was born, he wasn't mentioned, but from the beginning of Shemos. Actually, there are parshas in Devorim where Moshe is speaking in the first person, but he does not. He's not mentioned by name. What's the reason? And you may know this, it's understood to be a midrash, but it's not actually a midrash. Because Moshe said, please erase me from your book, that you've written. And when a wise person issues a curse, even if it's conditional, as this was, nonetheless, it is fulfilled. So Balaturim speculates famously that the reason Moshe is not mentioned by name in Tetzaveh, his name doesn't appear at all, is because it's a fulfillment. Of course, there's a couple of things to say about this. First of all, it presumes that the sin of the golden calf happened before the instructions to build the Mishkan, which is in fact the view of Rashi and many other commentaries based on a Midrash Tanchuma. But it's also worth noting that this could never be a Midrash, because in earlier times the parashas were divided differently. You'll be familiar with the fact that although it is not prevalent today in some communities, there was a triennial cycle. The parashas were divided into smaller sections, and the Torah was completed in 3 years, and there were different ways of chopping it. And so the Balaturim is thinking within the model with which we're familiar, but it would not have been an early midrash. Nonetheless, this idea is well known. It is widely quoted. Moshe somehow is missing from Tetzaveh. He's missing because he asked that his name would be deleted from the book. And somehow, even though that was conditional and the Jewish people survived, as we know, God forgave them for making the golden calf, it was fulfilled here in this section where Moshe is missing. And by the way, for those who are interested in these things, just on the side, and as you'll see, there's not very much more text in Hebrew. Interestingly, and I'm going to say this without comment, the Zohar, which is the classic of Jewish mysticism, which appears in the late 13th century, around the time of the Balaturim, actually says exactly the same idea. Man loch rav Moshe, who was greater than Moshe to Omar, who said, who said, exclaims to God, if you cannot forgive the people, please erase me from your book that you have written. And he said it because there was a need. He was trying to save the Jewish people. The Kudshu Baruch Ovid said, even though God did his will, meaning he forgave the Jewish people, im koldor, notwithstanding lo ishtaziv ma'onsho, he was not saved from punishment. Itma de lo itkava parshas v'atot tzaveh. And they say that he's not mentioned in the whole of section of Tetzaveh. This mechemi tamon v'ha ukmuho. And he's erased from there, and that's the fulfillment. So I suppose just as a matter of interest, please just hold me 1 second. My hand keeps raising. I was going to do it. So interestingly, that the Zohar quotes exactly the same idea. Now, before we begin to look at how Rabbi Sacks understood this phenomenon, and perhaps equate it to some further stories and aspects of his life, I want to introduce you to an extraordinary piece in the writings of Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen. Tzadok HaKohen Lublin was a most unusual character. He started off as a Lithuanian genius, and due to some very strange family circumstances, in the 1830s, traveling around Europe, he found himself in Hasidic Poland and discovered a man called Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Leiner, known as the Ishbitzer Rebbe, who was perhaps the most creative and possibly radical thinker of the entire Hasidic enterprise. And he became enamored of his ideas, of his person, and he abandoned his Lithuanian background, and he became a follower, a chassid of the Mea Sheloach of Ishbitz, as he became to be known. That was the name of his writings. And eventually, although not immediately, subsequent to the death of the Rebbe, he became the Rebbe in Lublin, and he died in 1900, leaving many, many works. He wrote some 70 books, some about the historiography of Jewish law, and in his later years, he wrote the Pre-Tzaddik, which are his thoughts on the parashas, which was his last great work near the end of his life. And in section 2 of Pre-Tzaddik on this parasha, he says the following, and this needs careful thought, and I'm going to try and tie some of these ideas together before moving to Rabbi Sacks's ideas and beginning to see how they fit together. One should understand, why should this be fulfilled, this concept? If we buy into the idea cited by the Balaturim and by the Zohar around the same time in the 13th century, that Moshe's name is missing from this parsha as a fulfillment of his request that he should be erased from the Torah in some way, why there? Why Dafka B'Zeh Parsha? Why it could have been anywhere? Why Tetzaveh? Neither of these seem to be dealing with, neither of the early sources seem to be dealing with it. But Yeshlama, one could say B'Zeh as follows: Ki inyan Parsha Zoi Medama Mekudushas Kahuna. This parsha is talking about the holiness of the priesthood. Shamaskum in Aneirus, it begins with lamps, as we saw. That's the opening line. And this is paraphrasing a midrash. Apparently, Aaron was downcast. That all of the families, the leaders of the tribes, had rushed forward to bring offerings, and somehow or other they got left out, and he was feeling miserable. When God said to him, you don't worry about it, you will inaugurate the Ohel Moed by lighting the lamps. Okay, that's the answer. You get the menorah. Don't be miserable. What's the idea of allocating the lighting of the lamp to Aaron more than any other offerings? After all those other offerings were brought by Aaron too, and even the offerings that were brought by the other tribal heads, Aaron's family would also bring them. They're also all public wash offerings. Well, what's the big deal? For Rakbad Loka Zohar, and only Aaron gets the lighting. Omnom. That's the kind of way he formulates the question. But let's see what he says in response. Hadlokas Aneris by Mikdosh, lighting the candles in the sanctuary, first in the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary, and later the Mikdosh, the temple in Yerushalayim. Yirmois alofas oir Torah moiragunus benefoshes Israel. This is hints to illuminating the light of the Torah, which is concealed within the souls of the members of the Jewish people, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, using the concept of oral teaching. Now, remember, we have the Torah Sheba'al, the fixed written text, and we have the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the rather more fluid, communicated law, and the two partner, they come together, and together, they form the revelation at Sinai. But lighting the lamps indicates to somehow kindling or illuminating this light of Torah Sheba'al Peh in every Jew. This power, this empowerment, which I'm going to call it now, playing to the title of the shir, this empowerment is Lahofia Lahoya B'Lev Yisrael or Torah Sheba'al Peh. His job is to excite the hearts of the Jewish people with the illumination of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, Agidad Lokas Haneris, through the oral Torah, through lighting the lamp. That's what it symbolizes. Lochein. And I missed that a lot. It's rather a long piece. I didn't want to spend more than a few minutes reading the text to give you some ideas, but Lochein. This is why the name of Moshe is absent from this parsha. Which refers to the sanctity of the priesthood, Kiyodua. Moshe's, as it were, his soul is tied up with the Torah. That's the Torah itself, the written Torah. But this is about the oral Torah. This is the parsha of the oral Torah. The Nizke Rak Baremez, and this is the key line. However, Moshe's name is mentioned Rak Baremez, just in a hint, but Lashoin in the following: V'atot et Saveh, you shall command. V'ato hakrave, and you shall draw near. Because ultimately, the sanctity of the priesthood and the sovereignty, as it were, the sovereignty of Jewish law that it represents, they spring also from the power and the holiness of Moshe. I'll explain in a moment. Let's just finish the text. Which come from the crown of Torah. That's the, if you like, the very root of the written Torah itself. That's sufficient. Let me explain what he's saying, what I believe he's saying. When we go back to our first source, the opening sequence of our parsha, the Ator is Moshe. It's all very well saying Moshe is absent, but he's not absent at all. The Ator is God speaking to Moshe. The Ator, God is speaking to Moshe. The Osiso, and you shall make. Of course, Moshe didn't make the garments himself, but he was responsible for ensuring they were made. He oversaw the production. The Ator, and now you shall speak. Moshe is there. He's there. But he is not there, as it were, explicitly. He's there implicitly. He empowers Aaron. Without Aaron, he's not there. God doesn't speak to Aaron directly. God speaks to Moshe, that you shall, as it were, empower Aaron to have this role. And this plays to the complex relationship in the writings of the Tzaddik HaKohen between the role of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, which is communicated, which has to be empowered. If you try to separate the written Torah from the oral Torah, you end up with something which isn't authentic. And by the way, this is a mid-19th century product that in the light of the challenge posed by the growing reform movement and the Enlightenment, which tried to suggest that the oral Torah is really manufactured and is not connected to the written Torah, many thinkers, including Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, strove to demonstrate that they were really one and the same. The one drives the other. As he said in his piece in Source 5, which you now can't see on the screen, the concept of Torah, revelation, the written Torah, which is Moshe Rabbeinu, empowers everything. It's behind the scenes. The two go hand in glove. Without one, you cannot have the other. That is what Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks is saying, that there is an extraordinary relationship between Moshe and Aaron. Moshe empowers, and Aaron is the charismatic speaker. We see all the way through. Aaron tien neviecha. Aaron will be your speaker, your spokesman. He speaks. He, as it were, applies the Torah to the circumstances and situation. But what's going on beneath the surface is that Moshe is there all along. The Torah Shabbat, the written Torah that Moshe represents, is there and is always there. Now, with those ideas in mind from classical sources, I'd like to discuss a few thoughts of Rabbi Sacks on this parsha and see how these things are a development of the concepts that we've just seen. So I'm quoting from a couple of different pieces that they labeled here. In source 1, who is honored? And these excerpts, these are long essays, all brilliant and all worth reading in the original, but these are segments. There's only one more page of text, you'll be pleased to hear. Tetzaveh is the only section from the beginning of Exodus, the end of Deuteronomy, that does not contain the word Moses. For once, Moses, the hero, the leader, the liberator, the lawgiver, is off stage. That's a great way of putting it. Reb Tzadok HaKohen is not saying he isn't there. He said the correct reading is that he is off stage, but he's not gone, he's there. Instead, our focus is on his elder brother Aaron, who elsewhere is often in the background. Indeed, virtually the whole Seder is devoted to the role Moses did not occupy, except briefly, that of priest, in general, high priest in particular. One of the recurring themes of Genesis is sibling rivalry. Rabbi Sacks writes about this a lot, and even in this essay, there's a great deal about it, but I culled it to a suitable size for this presentation. Sibling rivalry, hostility between brothers. This story is told at ever-increasing length 4 times. Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. But this is not the end of the story. There is a 5th chapter, the relationship between Moses and Aaron. Here, for the first time, there is no hint of sibling rivalry. The brothers worked together from the very outset of the mission to lead the Israelites to freedom. They address the people together. They stand together when confronting Pharaoh. They perform signs and wonders together. They share leadership of the people in the wilderness together. For the first time, brothers function as a team with different gifts, different talents, different roles, but without hostility, each complementing the other. Moses and Aaron were quite different in temperament and role. Moses was the man of truth. And it's worth mentioning that Rabbi Sacks cites a midrash, of which he's very fond, a quite long midrash, which I haven't brought here, which balances the roles of truth and peace. Peace requires a more flexible narrative. Truth requires a fixed narrative that fits the typology of Moshe as Torah Shebichsav, a fixed text with fixed words, and Aaron, the communicator of Torah Shebal Peh, which is more situation focused, conveying the same ideas, empowered by Torah Shebichsav, by the written fixed Torah, but articulated in a way that is suitable for circumstance, to bring people together to create harmony. Without truth, says Rabbi Sacks, there can be no vision to inspire a nation. But without internal peace, there is no nation to inspire. Aaron and Moses were both necessary. Their roles were in creative tension, yet they worked side by side, each respecting the distinctive gift of the other. So this is not exactly what Reb Tzadok HaKohen is saying, but he is noting a number of similar points, that there has to be a creative tension between the two. There cannot be an outward-facing, if you like, charismatic leader without something genuine and truthful and fixed that lies behind. The two go together. And in earlier generations, there was rivalry between sibling roles. But at this 5th stage, and I haven't seen anyone put it quite like this, other than Rabbi Sacks, that we reach a harmony, a partnership which is necessary. I would say that Moshe is the empowering leader and Aaron is the charismatic leader. They come together, they are balanced, and we have seen a lot of Moshe. And now we need some space to see Aaron, but without ever forgetting, to quote Rabbi Sacks, that Moshe is off stage. He's there in the background, as it were, working together to empower the other. In that regard, it is a development of the idea that we have seen in the writings of Reb Tzadok. Now, I'd like to move forward to another piece that I'm here, and this is the last piece of Rabbi Sacks that I have on here. This is an essay called The Counterpoint of Leadership. One of the most important Jewish contributions to our understanding of leadership is its early insistence of what, in the 18th century, Montesquieu called the separation of powers. Neither authority nor power was to be located in a single individual or office. Instead, leadership was divided between different kinds of roles. And Rabbi Sacks wrote about this very frequently. I remember in private conversations about this typology, the distinction between the prophet and the priest. And of course, in this regard, Moshe is the prophet and Aaron is the priest, very obviously. But I think they are, again, different versions of the same thing. Reb Tzolek HaKohen, what he said in the previous essay as well, about this tension. That here he develops the idea in a different direction. No less fundamental was the division of religious leadership itself into two distinct functions, that of the prophet and the priest. Rabbi Sacks lists, I think, 11 distinctions between the prophet and the priest. But here I have a much smaller excerpt that is dramatized in this week's parsha, focusing as it does on the role of the priest to the exclusion of that of the prophet. Tetzaveh is the first parsha since the beginning of the book of Exodus in which Moses' name is missing. It is supremely the priestly as opposed to prophetic parsha, i.e. it's the parsha of Aaron rather than the parshios of Moshe, which dominate the Torah from Shemos until the end. The roles of priest and prophet varied over time. The priests always officiated at the sacrificial service of the temple, but they were also judges. The Torah says that if a case is too difficult to be dealt with by the local court, you should go to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge who is in office at that time. Inquire of them, and they will give you the verdict. That is one of the core roles of the Kohen as described in Sefer Devarim in the book of Deuteronomy. Yet it is clear throughout Tanakh that the priesthood was liable to corruption. There were times when priests took bribes, others when they compromised Israel's faith and performed idolatrous practices. Sometimes they became involved in politics. One cannot imagine today a religious leader getting involved in politics, Some held themselves as an elite apart from and disdainful toward the people as a whole. At such times, the prophet became the voice of God and the conscience of society, reminding the people of their spiritual and moral vocation, calling on them to return and repent, reminding the people of their duties to God and to their fellow humans, and warning of the consequences if they did not heed the call. That is why the prophets were essential. They were the world's first social critics, mandated by God to speak truth to power, a phrase that Rabbi Sacks used often as well. Still today, for good or otherwise, religious establishments always resemble Israel's priesthood. Who, though, are Israel's prophets at the present time? Leadership in Judaism is counterpoint, a musical form defined as the technique of combining two or more melodic lines in such a way that they establish a harmonic relationship while retaining their linear individuality. It is this internal complexity that gives Jewish leadership its vigor, saving it from entropy, which means decomposition, the loss of energy over time. So Rabbi Sacks is saying that this parsha has to focus on the priesthood. It's essential that that role is emphasized because it has an essential function in law, but it has a problem. There's a problem associated with priesthood, and that is why it is balanced against the prophet. For this purpose, Moshe is the prophet and Aaron is the priest. Now, he is pointing out that religious leadership, not just political leadership, needs to be divided into these two areas, and this parsha does this admirably, and it creates the appropriate counterpoint, as it were, that each area of leadership retains its distinct identity while feeding off the other to create what will be a functional, but most important, a type of leadership which retains its checks and balances. Now, you will have noticed that one of the major focuses at the beginning of this parsha, and I'm actually going to stop the screen share now because I think we've finished with the text. One of the major themes at the beginning of the parsha are the priestly garments. In other essays, which I've not cited on the sheet in this parsha, Rabbi Sacks speaks about this, and he always emphasizes that the priest had robes of office. The priest wore a uniform, but the prophet did not wear a uniform. He also was interesting at pains to point out that the priestly role was confined to men, whereas the prophet's role could be occupied by men or women, and there are indeed 7 recorded female prophets in the Tanakh. That, once again, we are focusing on robes of office are about externalities, about the outward facing, the way one is perceived, rather than necessarily what's going on internally. There's much to say about this, a little bit beyond the scope of this talk. But there is a dichotomy and a dynamic between the roles of Moshe and Aaron between the purpose, the way the Torah is structured. There is intended to be a tension between the fixed, as it were, rigid Torah and the way it is interpreted and way it is structured. And while not for now, one looks at the writings of some very creative thinkers. I think particularly of the Dor Revi'i, by Moshe Shmuel Glasner, writing in the 1920s, talking about how one can retain the vitality of Torah Shebaal Peh, allow it its situational flexibility, while still enabling it to be empowered by by authentic Torah Shebaal. They are difficult questions in an environment where we work on precedent going back many centuries or even millennia. These ideas about empowering leadership and charismatic leadership, I think, are not just what the Torah is really telling us in this week's parsha. I think it lies behind the Balaturim's observation, which has become part of the narrative. Every school child is told Moshe doesn't appear in this week's parsha because he requested his name will be erased from the book when they made the golden calf. That's fraught with difficulties, of course, this idea, not just least the order that the story of the golden calf, as I mentioned, appears after Tetzaveh. So you have to be willing to reorder the parshas in the way the Midrash Tanchuma does. But irrespective of that, it's touching on some really critical ideas. That authentic Jewish leadership requires the charisma of the Torah Shebaal Peh, which is the role of Aaron, but it also requires the fixed role of the prophet, the grounding that's required, because charisma can also go with corruption, in that it is checked by the prophetic rigidity, which nonetheless must empower the charismatic leadership. And Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen's identified, I think, and I think about this every year, how the parsha itself is all about Aaron. It never mentions Moshe, but it mentions Moshe indirectly in almost every line. Aaron will only ever be successful if the peaceful role, his communicative, charismatic role, is a fair reflection of the prophetic aspirations as set by Moshe. So let me turn a little bit to thoughts about Rabbi Sacks in this context. I wanted to give a shiur in his memory. My mandate was to speak about this week's parsha, and I wanted very much to show how some of the ideas he articulates in this parsha, while not referring directly, he does refer to the Balaturim. He doesn't refer to the essay in Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, as far as I know. They very much dovetail, and you could see his ideas as a development, or if you like, an articulation of this concept that Rabbi Tzadok shares with us in his second essay on the parsha. But I also like to speak a little bit about Rabbi Sacks himself. I think it would be fair to say that he attempted throughout his career to balance these two roles within his own practice, his own teaching, his own rabbinate, his own chief rabbinate, and eventually, in the final years, following his retirement from the chief rabbinate, as a sort of global ambassador for Judaism, a role which he conducted with great aplomb and with tremendous success. That he was perhaps one of the greatest Jewish speakers, the greatest articulator of complex concepts, a wordsmith whom I know honed the words over and over and over again until they were clear, beautiful to read, easily digestible by learned audiences and beginners audiences alike. He had that ability to articulate, to present, to show a face to the Jewish and non-Jewish world of Jewish life, authentic traditional Jewish life, which was perhaps without parallel. But that charismatic leadership role did not in any way disturb what I would describe his parallel or complementary empowerment role, which many of my colleagues will remember from his time as chief rabbi, encouraging developments in certain areas. But I would say that I would say some very specific things, which is that he would probably have admitted, and I think he wouldn't mind me having said, that he tried to navigate both roles, and he did so generally with great success, but not always. There were things that went wrong, and he was willing to fail and try again. And there were episodes which the press will never forget, and areas in which he was phenomenally successful, but to be successful so many times was always about balancing the kind of internal and external roles. Sometimes it worked, and on other occasions it didn't. But it was always transformational, I think, not just for those who experienced it, those who had the privilege of working with him, but I think a presentation of Judaism and a way of thinking and a way of experiencing Jewish life, which was transformational for those who experienced it, even if they didn't always agree with it, and even if it always wasn't quite as successful as it might otherwise have been. But this had an enormous impact on my own development as well. I only really had an opportunity to think about this after his passing. But there is, I believe, a direct correlation between my own direction over the last, say, now 8 or 9 years, my own professional development, developing within my wonderful community with the support of tremendous lay leaders, but also finding my own path in my organizational work, in the broadcasting and other areas in which he encouraged me. Sometimes it was very direct, very enthusiastic encouragement for some areas of work I was conducting, whether it's student work, writing, broadcast, additional secular degrees, or whether it was finding a way to be that suited me better than perhaps some of the ways in which I had attempted to be before. Won't go into too many details, but in terms of my own development, my willingness to say things that needs to be said, to perhaps dress in a less conventional way, and to feel that I could navigate spaces in a comfortable way. All of this, I think, I can trace to the encouragement behind the scenes empowerment, which I didn't even notice, and perhaps until it was too late. And so it's also an opportunity to put on record, I think, his extraordinary influence on my own development, certainly prior to him stepping down as chief rabbi, but also in the years that I had the great pleasure and privilege of spending a lot of time with him as effectively a member of my community. I want to add a couple of little stories before winding up, which is a story which I did actually say in my hesped at the Levi, at the funeral. And it somehow or other captures for me my relationship with him. Around the time of his 70th birthday, my shul put on a little kiddush, just to kind of wish him mazel tov and to celebrate the occasion. And I gave a light-hearted drosha to thank him for his contribution and to mark his 70th birthday. Now, around this time, and in the drosha, I said in the drosha that one of the remarkable things about my community was that we had the most famous rabbi in the world in the community, and he was the stand-in when the rabbi goes on vacation. And that was absolutely true. There were many occasions when I was away, and Rabbi Sacks stepped in to give a drosha or otherwise, and people laughed, and he said nothing. The following week, it just so happened that the Baal Shachris, the person leading the morning davening, had a coughing fit, and he had to step down. And I stepped in and completed davening. And Rabbi Sacks came over to me and said, and it's also the only shul in which the rabbi is the stand-in chazan. So, I also learned that if one is going to give, one has to also receive. And it's a memorable moment. And Lady Elaine and I had a little chuckle about this story just after his passing. It's also an occasion to remember that he was an unbelievable reader, a voracious reader in every possible field. He read everything, he knew about everything, and he was sent many, many books to read and review. And he would even recommend things that he partially read and then apologize afterwards if they weren't very good. I remember one particular example. And I thought this was a wonderful thing, and we often shared book recommendations. Most of the time, he shared his ideas with me, and I thought this had absolutely kind of no downside until I put together my drosha, my big Rosh Hashanah drosha 1 year, and it was all ready to go. In fact, I'd shared it with a friend, a colleague, and he called me 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and said, "You're in deep trouble because Rabbi Sacks has just published his essay for Rosh Hashanah, and it's exactly the same as your sermon. It uses the same book, and he's even picked out the same quote from the book that you've done." Of course, this was a book we discussed, and he recommended it to me, or I'd recommended it to him, I don't remember. And so I found a way around it. I did kind of turn it into a little bit of a joke. He was not there for Rosh Hashanah, but sometimes that closeness led to some interesting results. But all of this plays back to the story. For Atot at Safer, it could be that sometimes the leader is not immediately visible. The leader does not always have to be visible. The only way in which new leaders can be created as being somewhat invisible. One of the conditions for lighting the menorah, as stated clearly in Bahalosecho, as later on when the menorah is mentioned again, is that when one lights the candle, the requirement is to remain holding the taper long enough that the flame rises on its own, meaning you can walk away and it's burning on its own. This is the mark of empowerment, and this, I believe, is why this idea appears in the discussion of the menorah. This is about empowerment, passing the message to another generation, to do it in your own way, but to find an authentic way of doing it that is yours. That is about empowerment. Sometimes empowerment is a replacement for charisma and for inspiration. Sometimes there are charismatic leaders with no content, they make no succession plan, they have no self-awareness, and they fail to empower others. Unfortunately, we see in the Jewish world, and I think in the general world, leaders who are either charismatic but with no self-awareness, or are so far in the background that you don't even know they're there. Rabbi Sacks was a very, very rare blend in which he was able to take the Aaron and Moshe elements, the Torah Sheba'al Peh and the Torah Sheba'al, the writings and the oral presentations, and meld them into a unique form of Jewish leadership, which continues to inspire us all.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Belovski. If anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat.
I don't currently see any questions.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Belovski, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And please ensure to join us next week for the next in the series.
Thank you.